Given the scientific research that's available and the neurology involved, there's a large amount of data that suggests that the emotional pain that you and I experience is qualitatively no different than, say, for example, the emotional pain an elephant or a chimpanzee may experience. So many anecdotes that suggest animals are entirely capable of feeling the pain of losing a loved one. And we believe that this has important ethical consequences because, again, as I said, the pain that you and I would experience emotionally is similar to what other species of animals experience. We've drawn upon the research of Mark Bekoff, who essentially argues that science reveals that there is indeed a core of primal emotions hardwired into the evolutionary limbic system, particularly the amygdala, which is the oldest emotional part of the brain. Human beings as well have this part of the brain, as do, however, fish, amphibians, reptiles, and birds. What it is a neural substrate responsible for any core primary emotion. So what it boils down to is that we share the same neural mechanisms that produce these emotions. And what Bekoff and others are suggesting is that even in some cases without a neocortex, which is the outer layer of the brain, the newer part of the brain, which is responsible for higher order thinking or even more developed emotions, is not needed for animals to experience emotions. With the medieval and modern periods, philosophers like Aquinas and Descartes, animals were seen to be lesser than human beings, in fact put there, say for example, by God for our use or for our domination, and they weren't thought to be able to self-reflect. But going back to your question earlier about animal grief, I mean clearly these animals are aware of the emotional experiences that they're undergoing. We had talked about elephants and elephant graveyards or wolves kind of lamenting the loss of others in the pack. I mean, clearly these animals are behaving as if they are subjects of a life who are perfectly capable of experiencing the same emotions that you and I do. But this was denied to them by Aquinas and Descartes. So by and large for the history of philosophy until this century, where these days now we focus more on the physical pain. Peter Singer, for example, in his animal ethics basis animal rights on whether animals can feel pleasure or pain, and we have a duty that they not feel pain unnecessarily. But I would like to include emotional pain along with physical pain as a criteria by which we can judge the welfare of animals. Living forms have an agency, and that agency ought to be respected. And we often think in terms of human agency, but neglect non-human agency. We tend to think that we have all the control or we make the decisions. However, there are other forms of life with their own goals in mind and their own subjective experiences. And scientifically today, we tend to ignore the qualitative dimension of those experiences. Schopenhauer, in fact, did have an animal ethics. He said that suffering was the basis, qualitatively speaking, suffering, it should be the basis of an animal ethics where we can empathize with other creatures who suffer. And interestingly too, Whitehead said that God is the fellow sufferer who understands. So really, it's through our emotive suffering that we are able to empathize and bond with other creatures who experience emotional lives like we do.
And that brings us back to the idea that emotion is running through all of this, linking all creatures
Yep.
to one another.
We encounter the same problem with human beings, and known as the problem of other minds. So it's like saying, well, because I can't access your emotions directly, that your emotional experience isn't real. And this is what phenomenology, I think, is important for both Stephanie and her work and mine, is that really we have an obligation to speculatively imagine experiences of non-human consciousness, okay? And that it's looking to animal behavior in terms of ethology, but philosophically opening the questions. I think to Nagel's credit, he does at one point say that a quote-unquote objective phenomenology is possible. And what this means is we can rely on a semiotic or symbolic expressive communication. We can look to how animals behave and trust that the way they're behaving indicates, just like you or I would look to each other to look at each other's facial expressions or vocalizations, et cetera, to say, okay, what is going on in there? It's not an absolutely closed mystery, although it is a mystery. Physiologically, we have analogs to derive that, okay, these experiences are similar in how they feel. So I don't think we should be discouraged that because that point of view is cut off, that we can't know that there is a qualitative experience going on. So in that sense, I feel both speculative philosophy and phenomenology are both very important. And I think Nagel hinted to that in his essay. The language of animals, they do have languages, they just do not use words like you or I use. For example, dolphins are able to communicate mostly through sound. The part of their brain that interprets sound is, I believe it's about 10 times larger than that same part of the brain in the human being. Some of our research that we've covered in our book talks about how each and every single dolphin has a unique name. They're able to communicate through clicks and noises and so on. And the same with elephants. Elephants are able to use infrasound below the range of human hearing. It's around 16 hertz, where they can emit a low grumble, which can travel really for about 12 to 15 miles and move itself around bushes and so on. So there's a lot of evidence that semiotic expression need not necessarily be in terms of human concepts per se or human language per se.